was Nick at night. The Pharisee Nick went to see Jesus at night. All right, his real name was Nicodemus, and while his story may not be as funny or as adventurous as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or SpongeBob SquarePants or even Full House and Friends, there's still some pretty good humor in this story that we have for today. Nick's story begins pretty abruptly, as Bible stories often do. There's no lead up to it, at least not in our text for today, but we know from the previous chapter of John's Gospel that Jesus had recently had some pretty good days and some not so good days. He'd been at a wedding in Cana and became the hero at the wedding because he had turned a lot of water into wine and had made a really fabulous Cabernet. But then he'd gone on to Jerusalem for the Passover and had actually managed to tick off quite a few of the religious leaders, because when he went into the temple, he saw these money changers and he had a cord of whips and he chased them out of the temple. This was not exactly the best way to gain friends. Of course, Jesus wasn't trying to gain friends. He was trying to do the work and the will of God. But when the people started chasing after him because of the signs that he was doing, he didn't trust their motives, so he kept himself from them. And that's where Nicodemus comes in. Nicodemus had heard about Jesus and he was curious about him. He wondered, how is it that he's doing all of these amazing signs? And that's where our gospel lesson today begins. It's sort of a once upon a time story. Now there was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a leader of the Jews. He came to Jesus by night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, because no one can do these signs that you're doing apart from the presence of God." It took a lot of courage for Nicodemus to go to Jesus. After all, he was a religious leader himself, and people should have been coming to him for counsel, for spiritual guidance. Imagine what his Pharisee companions would have thought if they knew that Nicodemus was sneaking off to Jesus. Well, no sooner has Nick acknowledged that he knows that Jesus is a messenger of God than Jesus starts in with him. Nick didn't even have a chance to ask Jesus a question before Jesus says, "Very truly I say to you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above." What? I didn't ask you about the signs that you're doing and how you're able to do them, and you're talking to me about the kingdom of God? And did you say something about being born again? Can a person go back into their mother's womb and be born a second time? I don't think so. All right, says Jesus, let's try this again. You want to know about how I'm connected to God? Then listen up, Nicodemus. And then in his serious rabbinical voice, Jesus says again, "Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and the Spirit." Now Nicodemus is even more confused. What's with the "very truly I tell you," amen stuff? And this business about being born again? What on earth are you talking about, Jesus? Clearly Nicodemus and Jesus are kind of missing each other. Nicodemus just wants to know how it is that Jesus is able to do the things that he's doing. And Jesus wants him to go deeper. After all, if Nicodemus risked coming to Jesus to begin with, even if it was at night, then he must have been seeking more than he was letting on. Something was missing in his life. And Jesus knew that. That's why he's talking with Nicodemus about the kingdom of God. That's why he was challenging Nick to think about his own spiritual life, about his own relationship with God, and what he needed to do in order to become a new person. Jesus went on, "Don't be astonished, Nicodemus, that I said to you, you must be born from above. The wind blows where it will. You hear the sound of it, but you don't know where it's coming from or where it's going." And that's just how it is with God and with everyone who's born of the Spirit. But how, says Nicodemus, how can this be? He still doesn't get it. And that's when Jesus really lets him have it. Frederick Buechner, who was a wonderful theologian and writer, describes this scene in this way. He says, maybe Nicodemus had 6 honorary doctorates and half a column in Who's Who. But if he couldn't see something as plain as the nose on his face, he'd better go back to kindergarten.